In the scorching heart of Texas, 1873, a lone preacher stands surrounded by 7 drunken bandits, their laughter echoing across the desert crossroads. They mock his Bible, his faith, and his seeming helplessness. What they don't know is that beneath his black preacher's coat lies a truth written in gunmetal and blood. For 15 years, Josiah Kane was the deadliest Texas Ranger west of the Pecos, with 47 notches on his gun and a reputation that made hardened killers tremble. These bandits think they're terrorizing a simple man of God. Instead, they've stumbled upon a legend who traded his badge for a Bible, a man whose hands are equally skilled with scripture and 6 guns. What follows is the story of how the most notorious gang in Texas learned that sometimes the Lord's vengeance comes in the form of hot lead and cold justice. A tale of how 7 drunken outlaws accidentally set in motion a reckoning 15 years in the making, unleashing a fury that had been held in check by nothing but faith and a collar. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Dawn painted the Texas sky in shades of blood and gold as Josiah Kane tended to his horse outside the weathered church of Lost Creek. His calloused hands, more familiar with gun oil than holy water, moved methodically through the morning ritual. First the horse, then the hidden weapons, finally the prayers, a routine 15 years in the making. Atlas, his battle-scarred Mustang named after the giant who carried the world's burdens, nickered softly as Josiah checked the special saddle he'd had made in Mexico. Beneath its worn leather panels lay compartments holding enough firepower to start a small war, or end one. "Easy, boy," he murmured, his voice carrying the gravelly weight of too many trail prayers and too much gun smoke. Inside the church, morning light filtered through crude glass windows, casting shadows across the simple altar where Josiah kept his 2 most precious possessions, a gilt-edged Bible and a wooden box containing his Texas Ranger badge. He lifted the Bible first, its pages worn smooth by daily readings, then hesitated before opening the box. The silver star inside caught the light, bringing memories sharp as thorns. The letter that had arrived yesterday lay unfolded beside the badge. The paper was cheap, the handwriting crude, but the message had shaken Josiah's carefully constructed world. Deacon James Lee spotted in Devil's Fork. 3 lines that threatened to undo 15 years of repentance. James Lee, the man who'd killed Josiah's wife and daughter while he was away on ranger business, the man who'd driven him from his badge to the Bible. Josiah's morning prayers came harder today. His fingers traced the cross hanging from his neck, then drifted unconsciously to the gun belt hidden beneath his black coat. The weapon's weight was a constant reminder of the man he'd been, and might need to be again. "Lord," he whispered, his voice echoing in the empty church, "grant me the strength to be your servant." He paused, the next words catching in his throat. "But if you require a sword of righteousness, let my aim be true." Sister Mary Catherine's arrival interrupted his devotions. The elderly nun had been his rock since he'd first arrived, blood on, his hands and demons in his heart. She took one look at his face and knew, the past never stays buried, does it, Josiah? "No, sister," he replied, tucking the badge and letter away. "But neither does justice." The memories came unbidden as Josiah rode his patrol around Lost Creek's outskirts. 15 years melted away like morning mist, carrying him back to that last day as a Texas Ranger. The day that changed everything. He'd been tracking James Lee's gang through the Brazos Valley, following a trail of robbed banks and murdered witnesses. 3 weeks of hard riding, sleeping in the saddle, living on jerky and revenge. Lee had earned his reputation as the most vicious killer in Texas, leaving a wake of widows and burning buildings across 4 counties. Just one more day, he'd Written to Sarah, his wife. Keep the home fires burning, my love. Kiss Mary for me. The letter never reached them. By the time he returned home, fire had already claimed everything he loved. The scene was burned into his soul, their small farmhouse reduced to ashes, 2 crossed markers in the yard, and Lee's calling card nailed to a scorched post. A deacon's cross, splattered with blood. The killer's signature, his mock tribute to the church he'd abandoned for a life of violence. Captain Reynolds found him 3 days later, half dead from whiskey and grief, his ranger's badge buried in the dirt beside his family's graves. "He's headed north, Josiah," Reynolds had said. "Let us handle it. Don't throw away 15 years of service for revenge." But Josiah was already beyond reaching. He'd strapped on his guns, ready to hunt Lee to the ends of the earth. That's when Sister Mary Catherine appeared, as if sent by Providence itself. She'd stood in his path, this tiny woman with iron in her spine and Christ in her heart. "Your wife taught Sunday school," she'd reminded him. "Your daughter sang in my choir. Would they want you to trade your soul for revenge?" Those words struck deeper than any bullet. Sarah had always said he was too good a man to let the violence of his job poison his heart. She'd prayed every night, for his safety, not just of body, but of spirit. The memory shifted to his first sermon, delivered with shaking hands and a voice unused to speaking words of peace. The congregation had been small, just Sister Mary Catherine and 3 old-timers too crippled to travel for a proper preacher. But in their weathered faces, he'd found something he thought he'd lost forever. Purpose. Atlas's nervous shuffle snapped. Josiah back to the present. The horse had stopped at the crossroads, ears pricked forward toward Lost Creek. Wagon tracks marked the dirt, fresh ones leading toward town, too many for ordinary traffic. Josiah touched the gun, hidden beneath his coat, then the cross at his neck. 15 years of running from his past, and now it had finally caught up. James Lee was coming to Lost Creek, drawn by rumors of gold in the collection plate. The devil was heading for God's house, not knowing that an avenging angel in preachers. Clothes was waiting. "Give me strength," Josiah whispered. But whether he was asking God or his dead wife, even he couldn't say. Lost Creek stretched before Josiah like a town caught between salvation and damnation. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across its dozen weathered buildings, the church steeple standing like a lonely sentinel against the Texas sky. Townsfolk paused in their daily routines, watching the preachers return with guarded eyes. Outside the general store, old Tom Wilson sat in his usual spot, shotgun across his knees. He'd been the first to accept Josiah 3 years ago, recognizing something in the preacher's walk that spoke of more than scripture. "Trouble brewing, Reverend," he called out. "Riders came through while you were gone, asking questions about the church's gold." Josiah reined Atlas to a stop, his face revealing nothing. "Lord's house holds nothing but salvation, Tom. Tell that to James Lee's bunch." Tom spat tobacco juice into the dust. Recognized one of his men. Same gang that hit the bank in Austin last month, left 3 dead, including a child. The lie about the church's gold had been deliberate. Bait set out months ago when Josiah first caught wind of Lee's movements. Now the trap was drawing shut, but innocence stood in the firing line. Sheriff Mills emerged from his office, star glinting dully on his chest. The lawman was new to Lost Creek, but his eyes held the sharp recognition of one who'd worn a badge long enough to spot his own kind. "Interesting sermon you gave last Sunday, Reverend. Part about Samson bringing down the temple sounded more like tactical advice than scripture." "Lord works in mysterious ways, Sheriff." Josiah dismounted, his movements fluid despite the weight of hidden steel beneath his coat. "Sometimes salvation requires a strong right arm, and sometimes," Mills stepped closer, voice dropping, "a Texas Ranger trades his badge for a collar, thinking it'll wash the blood off his hands. Recognized you, Kane. Was deputy in El Paso during your manhunt for..." The Carson boys. Josiah's hand tightened on Atlas's reins. That man died 15 years ago. Did he now? Mills glanced at the church. Because word is James Lee's riding this way. Man who killed your family. Mighty convenient he's choosing your town to hit. Before Josiah could respond, young Billy Thompson came running up, face flushed, with excitement. "Reverend, Sister Mary Catherine needs you at the church, says it's urgent." The sheriff's eyes never left Josiah. "Better go tend your flock, Reverend. Just remember, this is my town. Whatever you're planning, innocent people live here. Good people deserve protection," Josiah replied, leading Atlas toward the church. "Sometimes the good Lord sends shepherds in unusual guises." Inside the church, Sister Mary Catherine waited with news that confirmed his worst fears. "They defiled the Martinez family's graves," she reported, anger coloring her normally gentle voice. "Left a deacon's cross nailed to the headstone. He knows you're here, Josiah." Josiah stood before the altar, the weight of past and present pressing down like lead. The sanctuary he'd built, the peace he'd found, all of it balanced on a knife's edge. James Lee wasn't just coming to rob a church, he was coming to finish what he'd started 15 years ago. "Sister," he said finally, "perhaps it's time we discussed what's really hidden beneath this church." Sunday morning dawned clear and cold. The church bells toll carrying across Lost Creek's dusty streets. Josiah stood at the pulpit, watching his congregation file in. The usual faces, weathered ranchers, tired mothers, hopeful children. But today brought new additions. 5 strange men slouching in the back pews, trail dust still fresh on their boots and malice gleaming in their eyes. Josiah recognized one, Marcus Thorne, Lee's right hand during the Carson gang wars. The man's face was older, carved deeper by sin and violence, but the snake tattoo curling up his neck remained a brand of evil. Their eyes met briefly, recognition flickering like summer lightning. "Today," Josiah began, his deep voice filling the sanctuary, "we speak of Judas, who betrayed his master with a kiss." "Ain't that fitting?" Thorne called out, his interruption drawing gasps from the congregation. "A sermon about betrayal from a man who betrayed his badge." He stood, spurs jingling against wooden floorboards. "Ain't that right, Ranger Kane?" The church fell silent. Mothers pulled children closer, men's hands drifted toward hidden weapons. Josiah remained still, only his eyes moving as he counted threats. 5 visible, probably more outside. "This is a house of God," Josiah replied calmly. "All are welcome to hear his word, even those who've strayed from his path." Thorne laughed, an ugly sound like breaking glass. "Strayed? That's rich coming from you. How many men did you kill wearing that badge before you hid behind that collar?" He stepped into the aisle. "James Lee sends his regards. Says to tell you he remembers how your woman screamed." Josiah's hand tightened on the pulpit, aged, wood creaking under his grip. The gun beneath his coat felt heavy as sin. In the front pew, Sister Mary Catherine caught his eye, her slight shake of the head a reminder of his vows. "If you've come seeking salvation," Josiah said, each word measured, "you're welcome here. If not, I suggest you leave. Now." "Oh, we're seeking something." Thorne spat tobacco juice onto the church floor. "That gold you've been collecting. Lee figures a man of God won't mind sharing with his less fortunate brothers." "The only gold here is God's grace," Josiah responded, "though you seem more interested in earthly treasures." "We'll see about that." Thorne's hand dropped to his gun. "Services are over, folks. Everyone out except the good preacher here. We need to have us a private confession." The congregation hesitated, torn between fear and loyalty. Sheriff Mills wasn't in attendance, conveniently called away to handle trouble at a distant ranch. Another sign that Lee's planning ran deep. "Go home," Josiah told his flock. "The Lord's house will still be here next Sunday." As the people filed out, Thorne's men spread through the church, rifling through offering boxes and looking behind altarpieces. Sister Mary Catherine was the last to leave, her straight back and steady stride showing no fear. "Now then, Ranger," Thorne grinned, showing tobacco-stained teeth. "Let's talk about where you've really hidden Lee's gold, the stuff you took during that last raid before you found your calling." Josiah stepped down from the pulpit, his movements deliberate. "There was no gold, Marcus, there never was. Lee's using that story to settle an old score, and you're just his instrument. We'll see who's lying soon enough." Thorne nodded to his men. "Tear it apart, every board, every brick, and if the good preacher tries anything—" He drew his gun, the action loud in the sacred space. "Well, I reckon the Lord will welcome another martyr." Night fell over Lost Creek like a burial shroud. Josiah stood in the ransacked church, surveying the destruction by lamplight. Thorne's men had been thorough, pews overturned, floorboards ripped up, even the altar split apart. But they hadn't found what didn't exist, and their frustration had turned to malice. The crucified Christ hung crooked now, bullet holes framing his sorrowful face. "Guess he ain't the only one who suffered for others' sins," Thorne had sneered. Before leaving, his final act had been to carve a deacon's cross into the pulpit, Lee's message clear as morning bells. Sister Mary Catherine worked silently beside Josiah, gathering scattered Bible pages. Her hands trembled slightly, but her voice remained steady. "The children are afraid to come to Sunday school now. Mrs. Martinez says her boys woke screaming about men with guns in God's house." "Fear's their weapon," Josiah replied, straightening. "A fallen candelabra. It's what Lee's always used. And what weapon will you use?" She looked at him directly. "I saw your face when Thorne mentioned Sarah. Saw your hand move toward that gun you think I don't know about." Before Josiah could respond, hoofbeats thundered outside. Flames erupted against the church's eastern wall, burning bottles of whiskey, hurled by laughing riders. "Let's see how fast a holy man can run." Thorne's voice carried through the night. Josiah moved with a speed that betrayed years of training, pulling Sister Mary Catherine toward the back door. Outside, 5 mounted figures wheeled their horses in the darkness, more bottles arcing through the air. The dry wood of the church caught quickly, orange flames climbing toward heaven. "Ring the bell," Josiah commanded, already running for the well. "Wake the town." The church bell began to toll, its irregular rhythm speaking of the elderly nuns. Desperate efforts. Townspeople emerged from their homes, forming a bucket line, but as they approached, shots rang out, kicking up dust at their feet. "Stay back," Thorne called. "Lord's rendering judgment on false prophets tonight." Josiah stood alone in the firelight, water bucket forgotten in his hands. The gun under his coat pressed against his ribs, promising swift retribution. One motion, that's all it would take. He was still fast enough to take at least 3 of them. Before they could react, the old ranger in him calculated angles, trajectories, the sound of death waiting to be unleashed. "Preacher!" Tom Wilson's voice cut through his thoughts. The old man stood at the edge of the crowd, cradling his shotgun. "Say the word. Some sins need answering here and now." More townspeople stepped forward, armed with rifles and righteous anger. This was the moment. Josiah could feel it trembling in the air. One word from him would unleash hell itself. Blood would flow in Lost Creek tonight, blood that would never wash away. The church bell tolled on, its voice like Sarah's from the grave. She'd always said his badge was a cross to bear, but his true calling was to save souls, not send them to judgment. "Stand down," Josiah called, his voice carrying the weight of both cloth and leather. "This is still God's house, and I'll not have more blood spilled on holy ground." "You're weak, Ranger," Thorne laughed, wheeling his horse. Lee was right. "You've lost your teeth." They rode off whooping into the darkness, leaving behind a burning church and a town on the edge of violence. As the bucket line finally formed, Josiah helped pass water, each movement a prayer and a curse combined. "You did right," Sister Mary Catherine said later, as they stood in the smouldering ruins. "Turning the other cheek takes more courage than drawing a gun. Josiah touched the pulpit's carved cross, feeling the rage beneath his assumed peace. "Sometimes, sister," he replied softly, "turning the other cheek just gives evil men a second target." He looked toward the darkened horizon where his enemies had vanished. Tomorrow was another day, and Lost Creek's shepherd had decisions to make about wolves in his flock. Dawn found Josiah in the church cellar, moving aside a false stone in the wall. The hidden cache hadn't been discovered during the ransacking. A ranger's habit of preparation hadn't died with his badge. Inside lay memories wrapped in oiled cloth, a Winchester rifle, boxes of ammunition, and a gun belt tooled with the marks of his former office. "Forgive me, Lord," he whispered, fingers tracing the well-maintained weapons. "But sometimes your shepherd needs more than just a staff." The sound of horses drew him up the cellar steps. Through the broken church window, he spotted 3 of Thorne's men riding toward the Martinez ranch. Young Miguel Martinez had stood up to them yesterday, defending his sister from their lewd comments. Now they'd come to teach him manners, frontier style. Josiah moved like smoke through the morning shadows, rifle wrapped in his preacher's coat. He cut through Old Man Wilson's orchard, taking the high trail that overlooked the Martinez property. The route came to him without thinking. A ranger's instinct for tactical advantage never truly faded. The bandits had dismounted at the ranch house, kicking in the door. Miguel's sister's screams carried clearly in the morning air. Josiah settled behind a boulder, rifle resting comfortably in practiced hands. Through the sight, he counted heartbeats like his ranger captain had taught him. The first shot took the hat off the tallest bandit's head. The second sparked between another's feet. The third shattered a whiskey bottle just as it touched the leader's lips. Each shot placed with surgical precision, not to kill, but to remind them that death was just a quarter-inch adjustment away. "In nomine Patris," Josiah called out, his voice carrying across the yard. "That's Latin for get off this land before I forget my vows." "It's the preacher," one bandit shouted, diving behind a water trough. "Since when do holy men shoot like that?" "Book of Psalms teaches many lessons," Josiah responded, working the rifle's lever smoothly. Another shot knocked a pistol from a wavering hand. "Today, we're learning about divine intervention." The bandits scrambled for their horses, dignity forgotten in their haste. As they rode off, Miguel emerged from the house, eyes wide with newfound respect. "Reverend Kane, where did you learn to shoot like that?" "The Lord works in mysterious ways, son." Josiah wrapped the rifle back in its cloth. "Though sometimes he's clearer than others about what needs doing." By noon, word had spread through Lost Creek. The preacher had driven off Thorne's men without spilling a drop of blood. Some called it a miracle. Others, like Sheriff Mills, saw it differently. Divine intervention comes with a side of gun smoke. These days, Mills cornered Josiah outside the general store. "Those weren't warning shots, Reverend. That was calculated shooting, the kind they teach rangers." "God gave me steady hands," Josiah replied mildly, "for healing and for protecting his flock. Just remember," Mills stepped closer, "a badge means answering to the law. A collar means answering to a higher power. You're walking a dangerous line between the two." Later, in the quiet of the damaged church, Sister Mary Catherine found Josiah, cleaning the rifle with the same care he used for communion chalices. "You didn't kill them," she observed. "Not today," Josiah agreed, his hands moving with practiced efficiency. "But Thorne's just the outrider. When Lee comes—" He paused, looking at his reflection in the gun's polished stock. "Well, sometimes. The Good Shepherd needs to deal with wolves permanently. Just remember," she touched his shoulder gently, "the man I know saves souls. The man you were took them." Josiah nodded, but his eyes remained on the weapon in his hands. The line between preacher and ranger was blurring, and James Lee's arrival would soon force him to choose which side of that line to stand on. For now, though Lost Creek had seen that its shepherd had teeth and the skill to use them. Evening prayer meeting at the damaged church had drawn an unusual crowd. Instead of the usual widows and devoted mothers, the pews held ranchers, shopkeepers, and even a few grizzled miners from the hills. They came clutching rifles instead of Bibles, their faces set with grim determination. The good book speaks of time for peace and time for war, Josiah began, standing before his makeshift pulpit. But it also teaches us that wisdom is better than weapons of war. Today, we'll need both. Tom Wilson spoke up from his front row seat. "We saw your wisdom at work this morning, Reverend. Mighty fine shooting for a man of the cloth." "A shepherd learns to protect his flock," Josiah replied, then turned to address the gathering. "But one wolf can't guard against the whole pack. Lee's coming, and he's bringing hell with him." Young Deputy Carson, barely 20 but wearing his badge with pride, stepped forward. "Sheriff Mills rode out to the county seat for help, says we should wait for the law to handle this." "The law?" Old man Peterson barked a harsh laugh. "Law's 3 days' hard ride away. Lee's men will have picked our bones clean by then." Josiah moved to the church's side door, opening it to reveal a weapons cache he'd assembled. Rifles, shotguns, and ammunition boxes lay organized with military precision. The Lord helps those who help themselves. First, we need to know who can shoot, who can ride, and who can keep watch. The next hours transformed the church into something between a ranger station and a war room. Josiah divided the men into groups, assessing their skills with the experienced eye of a former lawman. Tom Wilson, it turned out, had been a cavalry scout during the war. Miguel Martinez could track a snake across sandstone. Even the widow Thompson revealed she'd been handling her late husband's rifle better than he ever had. "We're not training an army," Josiah explained, demonstrating proper rifle stance to a group of ranchers. "We're preparing shepherds. Each of you has something to protect: family, home, future. That's stronger than any outlaw's greed." Sister Mary Catherine watched from the doorway as Josiah moved among the townspeople, showing them how to improve their aim, how to work together, how to turn their church into a fortress. His preacher's collar seemed at odds with the gun on his hip, yet somehow he made both seem natural. "You're giving them hope," she said when he paused near her, "but you're also giving them the means for violence." "I'm giving them a choice," he corrected. "Same choice I had 15 years ago: lie down and die, or stand and fight." As dusk approached, Josiah gathered everyone in the churchyard. They'd organized watch rotations, established signals, created fallback positions. The town was becoming what he'd once known best: a coordinated unit with clear purpose. "Remember," he told them, "Lee's men expect to find scared townspeople. Let them keep thinking that. Work your lands, mind your stores, act normal, but be ready." Deputy Carson lingered after the others left. "Mills won't like this, organizing a militia without his say-so." "Not a militia, Deputy, just a flock looking after its own." Josiah checked his hidden rifle one last time. "Tell your sheriff when he returns. Sometimes the law needs to bend a little to keep justice straight." Later that night, alone in the church, Josiah knelt before the bullet-scarred crucifix. 15 years ago, I swore to put away the gun and pick up your word. Now I'm teaching good people to kill. If that's a sin, Lord, add it to my account. But don't make them pay for my past." The only answer was the wind through broken windows, carrying the sound of hoofbeats from the distant hills. Somewhere out there, James Lee was coming, drawn by false rumors of gold and true whispers of an old enemy. When he arrived, he'd find more than just a preacher waiting. He'd find a town that had learned the difference between turning the other cheek and turning a blind eye to evil. The orphanage attached to Lost Creek's church had always been Josiah's pride, a place where abandoned children found hope instead of hardship. Now, watching smoke rise from its roof at midnight, that sanctuary was becoming a battleground. Got 6 of them. Miguel whispered from his lookout position in the bell tower. They've got Tommy and little Sarah cornered in the dormitory. Sister Mary Catherine's trying to get the other children out the back. Josiah moved like a shadow through the church grounds, his preacher's coat discarded for darker garb. Two of Thorne's men guarded the orphanage's main entrance, passing a bottle between them. Their laughter carried across the yard as flames began. "To lick at the wooden shingles. Burn them out," Thorne's voice commanded from somewhere in the darkness. "Let the holy man choose between his precious secrets and these little lambs." The rage Josiah had buried beneath 15 years of scripture bubbled to the surface. These men hadn't just crossed a line, they'd spat on everything sacred. His hand moved to the ranger's gun belt he now wore openly. "Lord," he prayed, voice barely a whisper, "forgive me for what must be done." The first guard never saw what hit him. A precise strike to the throat silenced any alarm. The second reached for his gun, but found himself disarmed by hands that had never forgotten their deadly training. Both men were unconscious and bound before they could alert their companions. Inside, smoke filled the upper floor. Josiah could hear children crying, Sister Mary Catherine's voice trying to keep them calm. Through the haze, he spotted Thorne, himself standing at the dormitory door with a torch in one hand and gun in the other. "Come on out, Ranger," Thorne called. "Got some young'uns here mighty interested in learning about the fires of hell." Josiah's voice came from the shadows, carrying the cold authority of his former office. "Only hell these children will see is what I send you to, Marcus." The speed of his movement shocked even the hardened outlaws. One moment he was a voice in darkness, the next a dealing death angel. His first shot took the torch from Thorne's hand. The second disarmed one of his men. The third showed that some sins could only be answered with lead. "The children," Sister Mary Catherine's voice cut through the chaos. "Josiah, we can't get through the back stairs." Time slowed as it used to in firefights. Josiah saw everything. With crystal clarity, the positions of the remaining outlaws, the spreading fire, the routes of escape. His body moved with the fluid grace of countless battles, each shot precise, each movement calculated. "Door to your left," he commanded. "Count 3 and run. Keep the children low." As the sister led her charges to safety, Josiah provided cover that proved years of ranger training hadn't faded. 3 more of Thorne's men fell, not dead but wishing they were. Only their leader remained, now backing away with fear replacing his earlier bravado. "You're still him," Thorne gasped, clutching a wounded arm. "Still the ghost that haunted the territories. Lee was right, the collar's just a mask." "The collar's redemption," Josiah corrected, advancing inexorably. "The gun's justice. Tonight, you needed both." Thorne fled into the darkness, leaving his men and his failure behind. By the time the townspeople arrived to fight the fire, the children were safe and the surviving outlaws bound for the jail. But something had changed in how they looked at their preacher. They'd seen more than skill with a gun. They'd witnessed the lethal grace of a legend they'd only heard whispered about, the ranger who'd brought law to the lawless territories. The shepherd had shown his wolf's teeth, and there was no hiding them again. Sister Mary Catherine found him later, cleaning his guns with mechanical precision. "The children are asking if angels carry pistols," she said softly. "I didn't know how to answer them." Josiah looked at his hands, still steady after dealing out violence. "Tell them angels carry what they must to protect the innocent. And tell them—" He paused. "Tell them their preacher hasn't forgotten his prayers, just added some old ones." Back out in the night, the wind carried word to James Lee that his old enemy hadn't gone as soft as he'd hoped. The real battle for Lost Creek's soul was about to begin. The town meeting in Lost Creek's scorched church wasn't supposed to happen. Sheriff Mills had called it after returning from the county seat, his face grim as he'd read reports about the orphanage incident. Now, the pews were packed with townspeople. all eyes fixed on their preacher. 15 dead outlaws across 3 territories, Mills read from a yellowed wanted poster. 22 more brought in alive. The ghost of the territories, they called him. The ranger who could outshoot Apache. Scouts and trackmen across bare rock. He looked up at Josiah. That was before he vanished. Same time James Lee's gang burned out a ranger's family. The silence in the church felt heavy as a coffin lid. Josiah stood before his congregation, no longer just their preacher, but a man revealed. His ranger's badge lay on the pulpit beside his Bible, silver star catching the morning light. "You lied to us," Sarah Thompson spoke up, her voice trembling. "All these years, pretending to be a simple preacher." "Never pretended that," Josiah replied quietly. "Everything I taught from this pulpit was true. Everything I believed about redemption, about grace, all of it real." "But you're him!" young Tommy Martinez burst out, excitement overcoming his mother's restraining hand. "The ranger they tell stories about, the one who caught the Carson brothers single-handed." Old Tom Wilson cleared his throat. "Explains why. No bandits ever bothered Lost Creek much these past years. Word must have spread about who was watching over us." Sheriff Mills stepped forward, his boot heels loud on the wooden floor. "Question is, what's James Lee really coming for? Not church gold. That was never real. He's coming for you, isn't he?" Josiah's hand rested on his Bible, fingers inches from where his gun belt now hung openly. 15 years ago, I was tracking Lee's gang. They were hitting banks, stages, whole towns. But I got too close. While I was following false trails, Lee found my home. His voice carried the weight of ancient grief. "My wife Sarah taught Sunday school. My daughter Mary loved to sing hymns. Lee left their bodies in our burning house with a deacon's cross, his calling card." "So you became a preacher to hunt him?" someone called from the back. "No," Sister Mary Catherine answered before Josiah could. "He became a preacher to save himself, to find something beyond vengeance." She stood facing the congregation. "I was there when he arrived, covered in blood and gun smoke. Saw him struggle between the badge and the Bible." "And now," Mills pressed, "Lee's coming here, bringing war to our town. Which man will face him, the preacher or the ranger?" Josiah lifted his badge, letting it catch the light. 15 years ago, I had to choose between justice and vengeance. Chose wrong. Let hatred drive me until I almost lost my soul." He set the badge beside his Bible. "Now I wear both, the star and the collar, because sometimes protecting the flock means more than just prayers." The church erupted in voices, some afraid, some angry, many understanding. Through it all, Josiah waited, watching his people wrestle with this revelation. Finally, Tom Wilson stood. "Reckon the Lord works in mysterious ways. Sent us a shepherd who knows how to fight wolves." He looked around the church. "Anyone here?" "Sorry, our preacher knows how to shoot straight." A ripple of nervous laughter broke the tension. One by one, people stood, showing their support. Even Sarah Thompson managed to smile. "My Jake always said you handled a gun too well for a simple preacher." Guess he was right, but Sheriff Mills wasn't finished. "Fine words, but Lee won't care about redemption stories. He's bringing an army, and badges, even ranger badges, won't stop him." "No," Josiah agreed, buckling on his gun belt. "But a town. United might. Lee's expecting to find a soft target, a preacher playing at being his old enemy. Instead, he'll find Lost Creek ready for him." He looked at his congregation, seeing not just faithful followers, but potential warriors. "Question is, are you ready to stand with both your shepherd and your ranger?" The answer came in the sound of men checking weapons, women gathering children, a community preparing for war. Lost Creek had chosen its path, following a man who carried both Bible and gun, seeking not just survival, but redemption. As the meeting ended, Sister Mary Catherine remained behind. "They know everything now," she said softly. "No more hiding behind the collar, Josiah touched his badge, then his Bible. No more hiding, he agreed. But no more running either. Time to be both men God made me to be. Outside, the wind carried dust from the east, the direction Lee would come from. The badge under the Bible had been revealed, and Lost Creek would never be the same. James Lee rode into Lost Creek at high noon, the sun casting no shadow beneath his black horse. 20 riders followed him, hard men with dead eyes and well-worn guns. They formed a dark parade down the town's main street, past shuttered windows and closed doors. Lee sat his horse like a prince of hell, his deacon's collar a mockery of the faith he'd abandoned. A long scar ran from his left eye to his jaw, a souvenir from his last meeting with Ranger Kane. His voice carried easily in the dusty silence. Come out, wherever you are," he called, the words sing-song but dripping venom. "Time for confession, Brother Kane." Josiah stood in the church doorway, Bible in one hand, other hand near his gun. He studied his old enemy through eyes that had seen too much death. Lee had aged, but like fine poison, he'd only grown more lethal with time. "Been a long time, James," Josiah replied, his voice carrying the weight of 15 years waiting. "Still wearing that collar like you got a right to it?" Lee's laugh was sharp as broken glass. "Look who's talking about rights, the killer who hides behind a cross thinking God'll wash the blood off his hands." He gestured at the town. "Nice flock you've gathered. Shame if something happened to them. They're under my protection." Josiah stepped into the street, sunlight glinting off his ranger's badge now worn openly beside his preacher's collar. "Protection," Lee spat in the dust. "Like you protected your own family. I remember that night, Kane. Remember how your Sarah begged for mercy, how little Mary cried for her papa." His smile was a devil's grin. "But papa was too busy playing ranger, wasn't he?" Josiah's hand tightened on his Bible, but his voice remained steady. "You've brought your men to die, James. One last chance. Right out now. Die." Lee looked around theatrically. "All I see is one worn-out ranger playing preacher, a coward who couldn't even avenge his own blood." He raised his voice to address the hidden townspeople. "Hear that? Good folks have lost. Creek, your shepherd's been lying to you. Ask him how many men he killed before finding religion. Ask him about the blood on those hands that bless your babies." Movement caught Josiah's eye. Sheriff Mills had positioned himself on the hotel balcony, rifle ready. Tom Wilson and his sons were in place behind the general store. The Martinez brothers waited in the livery stable, armed and prepared. The town wasn't as empty as Lee thought. Found religion. Josiah took another step forward. "No, James. Found purpose. Found people. Worth protecting, worth dying for." His eyes hardened. "Worth killing for if you force my hand." "Force your hand?" Lee laughed again. "You had your chance for revenge 15 years ago, chose to hide behind that collar instead. Now?" He drew his gun with snake-like speed. "Now I'm going to burn another family, burn this whole damn town, and make you watch before I send you to meet your women." The street held its breath. 2 deadly men faced each other across sun-baked dirt, while above them storm clouds gathered like God's own judgment rolling in. "Last warning," Josiah said softly. "Leave my flock in peace." Lee's answer was a bullet that kicked up dust near Josiah's feet. "Your flock?" he sneered. "They're about to learn what happens when they trust a false shepherd." He raised his hand, and his men spread out through the town like a dark tide. But as they moved, shutters opened, revealing rifle barrels. Townspeople emerged from hiding, armed and grim-faced. Lee's smile faltered as he realized the town wasn't helpless. It was a trap, waiting to be sprung. Well, he recovered quickly. "Taught them to bite back, did you? Good. More fun that way." He turned to his men. "Burn it all. Let's send this whole town to meet their maker." The first shot came from the church bell tower, Sister Mary Catherine proving she could do more than ring bells. The battle for Lost Creek was about to begin, and with it a reckoning 15 years in the making. Thunder rolled across the Texas sky like God's own drums calling men to war. Between the church and the devil, Lost Creek would find its salvation or its damnation before the sun set. The first explosion rocked Lost Creek like God's own thunderbolt. Tom Wilson's dynamite, hidden beneath the water trough, sent 3 of Lee's men flying. Before the dust settled, the street erupted in gunfire, transforming the quiet town into a battlefield. Josiah moved like his old ranger namesake, a ghost in the chaos. His first shot took a bandit off his horse at 30 paces. His second saved young Miguel Martinez from a flanking attack. Each movement was precision itself. Years of combat experience flowing through muscle and bone. "The church!" Lee's voice carried over the gunfire. "Burn his precious temple down!" 4 riders broke from the main group, carrying torches. They made it halfway before Josiah's rifle spoke 3 times. 3 riders fell. The 4th dropped his torch, turning his horse so hard it nearly fell. "Preachers still got teeth," someone shouted from the hotel, and the Lord said, "Let there be light." Sister Mary Catherine's voice rang out as she threw a lantern from the bell tower. The explosion of whale oil scattered another group of bandits trying to circle behind the general store. Lee's men found themselves caught in a crossfire of biblical proportions. Every window held a rifle, every alley concealed a defender. The townsfolk fought with the determination of people protecting their homes, their skills honed by weeks of Josiah's training. "Push them toward the livery," Josiah commanded, his voice carrying the authority of both ranger and preacher. He moved through the gun smoke like a vengeful spirit, each shot finding its mark with deadly accuracy. A bandit burst from behind a tall water barrel, gun blazing. Josiah's draw was invisible to the human eye. One moment his hand was empty, the next his Colt roared twice. The outlaw's bullets hit empty air where Josiah had been standing a heartbeat before. Still fast as ever. "Kane!" Lee called out, shooting from behind his horse. "But can you save everyone like you saved your family?" 3 of Lee's men broke into the general store only to find Sarah Thompson waiting with her husband's shotgun. The blast took out the front window and 2 bandits. The 3rd fled, bleeding. "The Lord helps those who help themselves," she shouted, reloading with practiced hands. Sheriff Mills proved his worth, his rifle dropping 2 outlaws trying to flank the church. But Lee's men were experienced killers. They regrouped, using buildings for cover, returning fire with deadly precision. A bullet caught Deputy Carson in the shoulder, spinning him into the dust. Josiah covered the distance in seconds, dragging the young lawman to safety while his Colt barked death at anyone trying to interfere. "Just like El Paso," Mills called out, referring to the legendary shootout where Ranger Kane had saved his whole posse. "El Paso was quieter," Josiah returned, checking Carson's wound. "The deputy would live, thanks to quick action and divine providence." The battle shifted as Lee's men realized they faced more than simple townspeople. These defenders moved with coordination, covered each other with disciplined fire, showed the deadly skills of their ranger-turned-preacher-teacher. "Fall back!" Lee commanded, rage evident in his voice. "Regroup at the creek!" His horse danced in the gunsmoke as he pointed at Josiah. "This isn't over, Kane. Got something special planned for your flock." As the bandits retreated, leaving their dead behind, Josiah reloaded with mechanical precision. Around him, the town assessed its wounds. Buildings bore bullet holes. But the church still stood. A few defenders had taken minor injuries, but thanks to preparation and providence, no one had died. "Preacher," Tom Wilson approached, shotgun smoking. "Reckon that sermon about David and Goliath means something different now." Josiah helped Sister Mary Catherine down from her bell tower perch. "Sometimes faith needs a helping hand, and sometimes—" He checked his ammunition. "That hand needs to be steady on a trigger." But as the townsfolk emerged from cover, celebrating their victory, Josiah's eyes remained fixed on the distant creek. Lee's parting words worried him. His old enemy was many. Things, but never one to make idle threats. He'll be back, Sister Mary Catherine said softly, with worse than guns and torches. Josiah nodded, already calculating defense positions, planning for the next assault. The first battle had been won, but the war for Lost Creek's soul was just beginning. And somewhere out there, James Lee was preparing something that would test both the ranger's skill and the preacher's faith to their limits. Night fell over Lost Creek like a funeral shroud. Josiah stood in the church basement, lantern light revealing what Lee's men had been too blind to see during their earlier search. Sister Mary Catherine watched as he ran his hands over the ancient stone wall, finding the hidden marks that had been there long before either of them arrived. "All these years," she whispered, "you knew what was really here." "Knew the moment I saw the mason marks," Josiah replied, fingers tracing the Spanish crosses carved into the foundation stones. "This church wasn't built by the first settlers. It was built by conquistadors." The wall swung open at his touch, revealing a narrow passage. The air that rushed out carried the weight of centuries and the smell of secrets best left buried. "Lee's not after gold," Josiah continued, lifting his lantern to illuminate rows of ancient documents and artifacts. "He's after this, the lost. Records of the Spanish Inquisition's northern expedition. Dark things happened here, sister, things the church wanted forgotten." "But how does Lee know?" she asked, crossing herself as she glimpsed the weathered instruments of torture among the relics. "Because," a new voice interrupted, "I was the one who told him." Sheriff Mills stepped from the shadows, his gun trained on Josiah. 15 years ago, when he burned your family, that was about finding these records. You were just in the way." Josiah turned slowly, seeing his old friend through new eyes. "You've been his man all along. Every time Lee's gang hit a church." "Looking for this one," Mills nodded. "These documents prove the church's crimes against native tribes, show where they hid their stolen treasures. Worth millions to the right buyers, worth enough to buy a man's soul. Or lose it," Sister Mary Catherine said softly. "Lee didn't just happen to find my family." Josiah's voice carried the cold certainty of revelation. "You told him where they were, led him right to them. Had to slow you down," Mills shrugged. "You were too close to finding this place. Lee knew you'd eventually hide here, try to protect it. That's why he let you live, to lead him right back when the time was right." Upstairs, floorboards creaked. More of Lee's men surrounding the church. The trap was closing. "Whole town's going to burn this time," Mills continued. "Lee's bringing enough men to make sure of it. But you can save them, Kane. Just surrender." "The documents." Josiah's hand hadn't moved toward his gun. "These records detail atrocities, Mills, crimes that broke both man's law and God's. That's what you're killing innocent people for? That's what men have always killed for." Lee's voice carried down the stairs as he descended. "Power, secrets, the things people want buried." He emerged into the lantern light, ever-present deacon's collar stark against his black coat. "Hello. Kane, finally found what your Sarah died protecting." The truth hit Josiah like a physical blow. She knew. That's why she was teaching here, wasn't it? The church sent her to guard this place. Lee's smile was cold as a snake's. "Smart woman. Your wife. Wouldn't tell us where the entrance was, even at the end. But you've done what she wouldn't, led us right to it." "And now?" Josiah asked, though he already knew the answer. "Now." Lee gestured upward. "Now the whole town burns. Can't leave witnesses to something this big. But I'll make you the same offer." I made her. "Tell us if there are any other records, any other sites, and I'll make it quick for your flock." Sister Mary Catherine's hand found Josiah's arm. "The children," she whispered. "He's got men at the orphanage." Josiah stood in the heart of his church, the weight of lives heavy on his soul. The ranger in him calculated odds, angles, possibilities. The preacher in him prayed for guidance. And somewhere between the two, he found his answer. "I'll tell you everything," he said slowly. "But only you, Lee, man to man. These documents hold more secrets than you know." Lee studied him. then nodded. "Mills, watch the sister. Kane and I have some truth to speak." He stepped closer, triumph in his eyes. "Finally choosing the smart path, old friend." Josiah met his gaze steadily. "No," he replied softly. "Finally choosing the right one." His hand moved toward the lantern, and in that moment, both ranger and preacher knew exactly what needed to be done to protect both his flock and the church's dark secrets. The Church of Lost Creek erupted in flames at midnight, its ancient timbers feeding a fire that painted the Texas sky in shades of hell. Josiah emerged from the burning basement carrying Sister Mary Catherine, his black coat scorched, his face streaked with soot and blood. Behind him, Lee's anguished screams mixed with the roar of collapsing beams. "The documents!" Mills shouted, his sheriff's badge glinting in the firelight. "You've destroyed everything." "Not everything," Josiah responded, laying the sister gently. "On the ground, just the evil men would kill for." The explosion had taken Lee by surprise, the hidden powder kegs beneath the church turning the secret chamber into an inferno. But Josiah had known they were there, placed by his own hands months ago, prepared for just such a moment. "You've killed us all." Mills raised his gun, desperation in his eyes. "When Lee's men see this, they'll see justice." Tom Wilson's voice rang out. The old man emerged from the shadows, leading a group of armed townspeople. All around the burning church, Lost Creek's defenders appeared, weapons ready. Lee staggered from the basement door, his fine black coat ablaze. The scar on his face seemed to glow in the firelight as he drew his gun. 15 years, he screamed. 15 years hunting these secrets, and you burn them like trash." "Some secrets deserve burning," Josiah replied calmly. "Some sins need cleansing by fire." The truth of Sarah's death now lay exposed in the flames. Not just random violence, but a desperate search for documents that could shake the very foundations of faith. Lee had killed her to find them. Now he'd lost everything. "Kill them all," Lee commanded his men. But as they moved to obey, the town of Lost Creek revealed its teeth. From every window, every alley, rifles appeared. The townspeople had learned well from their preacher, not just about faith, but about fighting for what mattered. They weren't just defending buildings now, they were protecting their very souls. "Your choice, Lee," Josiah's voice carried over the crackling flames. "Leave now, or join your secrets in the fire." Mills made his decision first, turning to run. He managed 3 steps before Tom Wilson's shotgun roared, dropping him in the dirt. The badge he'd dishonored landed beside him, stained with the blood of his betrayal. Lee's men began to break, seeing their hopes of fortune literally going up in smoke. But their leader wasn't finished. With a howl of rage, he charged Josiah, guns blazing in both hands. Time slowed as Josiah drew. The ranger's speed met the preacher's calm, producing something deadly and pure. His first shot took Lee's right. Gun the second his left. The third struck the false deacon's collar, spinning him around. "She died protecting those secrets," Lee gasped, blood staining his shirt. "Your precious Sarah died telling us nothing. And now you've finished what she started." "No," Josiah corrected, standing over his fallen enemy. "She died protecting something more important. The same thing I protect now, innocent souls from men like you." The church's steeple collapsed in a shower of sparks and burning timber. "Sister," Mary Catherine watched it fall, tears streaming down her face. "All those records, that history, better lost than used to hurt more people," Josiah replied. Around them, the townspeople began organizing bucket lines, trying to save the surrounding buildings. Lee's surviving men fled into the night, leaving their dead and their dreams of fortune behind. As dawn approached, Josiah stood in the smoldering ruins of his church. The secrets hidden beneath it were gone forever, but perhaps that was God's will. Some sins needed to stay buried, some truths were too dark for light. "We'll rebuild," Tom Wilson said, joining him. "Stronger this time." Josiah nodded, touching. the cross that still hung around his neck. The church might be gone, but its spirit remained in the people who'd fought to protect it. Sometimes, he reflected, the holiest ground wasn't in buildings or secret chambers, but in the hearts of those who stood against evil. The sun rose over Lost Creek, promising a new day. But the night's fire had changed everything, burning away lies and leaving only hard truth behind. The final battle was coming, and when it did, it would test more than just guns and courage. It would test the very soul of every person in Lost Creek. Dawn found Josiah Kane standing in the ruins of his church, watching dust clouds rise from the east. Lee's reinforcements were coming, hardened killers drawn by promises of Spanish gold, now riding for revenge. Sister Mary Catherine joined him, her habit still smelling of smoke from the night's inferno. "They say there's 40 of them," she said quietly, "cutthroats and gunmen from every territory." 40 pieces of silver, Josiah mused, checking his ammunition. Judas's price for betrayal. Seems fitting. The town of Lost Creek had transformed overnight. Women and children sheltered in the sturdy stone bank, while every able-bodied man and more than a few determined women prepared defenses. Tom Wilson supervised the construction of barricades, his war experience showing in every calculated position. "Like Vicksburg," the old man commented, directing the placement of sandbags. "Except this time we're fighting for something worth saving." Young Miguel Martinez returned from his scouting ride, his horse lathered with effort. 3 hours, he reported. To Josiah, "They're moving slow, making sure we see them coming." Lee's with them, wrapped in bandages, but still in the saddle. Josiah nodded, unsurprised. He'd known his old enemy wouldn't die easily. "Get some rest," he told the boy. "You'll need it soon enough." In what remained of the churchyard, Josiah gathered his makeshift congregation. They weren't many, 30 defenders against 40 killers, but they had something Lee's men lacked. They were fighting for their homes, their families, their very souls. "Most of you never asked for this." "Fight," he began, his preacher's voice carrying clear in the morning air. "Never wanted to stand between good and evil. But that's where the Lord often puts us, not where we want to be, but where we need to be." Sarah Thompson stepped forward, her husband's rifle held with familiar comfort. "We've chosen our side. Reverend, question is, which man will lead us, the preacher or the ranger?" Josiah touched his collar, then his gun belt. 15 years ago, I thought I had to choose between justice and mercy, between the badge and the Bible." He looked at their faces. Farmers, shopkeepers, ordinary people preparing to face extraordinary evil. "I was wrong. Sometimes God's work needs both." Sister Mary Catherine emerged from the bank's makeshift hospital, where she'd been tending the wounded from the night's battle. "I've given them last rites," she said softly, "just in case." "No last rites today," Josiah replied firmly. "The Lord's not finished with Lost Creek yet." He outlined their defense plans, positions carefully chosen, to protect every approach. The townspeople listened with grim determination, asking smart questions, offering suggestions based on their knowledge of the land. They weren't soldiers, but they'd learned well from their preacher's lessons. "One last thing," Josiah said as they prepared to take their positions. "Whatever happens, remember, you're not just fighting for your lives. You're fighting for your souls. Lee and his men, they're not just bringing guns to this battle, they're bringing darkness itself." "Then we'll need light," Sister Mary Catherine said, producing candles from her habit. One by one, she lit them, from a lamp that had survived the church fire. "The Lord said, 'Let there be light.' Today, we are that light." As the defenders took their candles, Josiah felt something shift in the air. These weren't just scared townspeople anymore. They were warriors of faith standing against the coming darkness. "Whatever happens," he told them, "I want you to know, serving as your preacher has been my redemption. Fighting beside you will be my honor. Tom Wilson spoke for them all. "And dying beside you, if it comes to that, will be our glory." The sun climbed higher, burning away the morning mist. Soon it would reveal Lee's army approaching from the east. Josiah made his final rounds, checking positions, offering quiet words of encouragement. At each post, he saw not fear, but resolution, not doubt but determination. In what remained of his church, Josiah knelt one last time. "Lord," he prayed, "guide my hand in what must be done, and forgive me for what I must do." The first rider appeared on the horizon, then another and another. The final battle for Lost Creek was about to begin, and with it, a reckoning 15 years in the making. The first shot of the battle for Lost Creek came not with a bang, but with the musical ping of a church bell. Sister Mary Catherine, positioned in the remains of her bell tower, had turned the broken bell into a sniper's perch. Her single shot dropped Lee's lead scout before he could signal the main force. "First blood to the Lord's side," Tom Wilson muttered from his position behind a barricade of overturned wagons. Lee's response was immediate and overwhelming. His 40 riders split into smaller groups, each attacking from a different direction. They'd learned from their last assault. No more charging straight down the main street. This was a coordinated attack by experienced killers. "Remember your training!" Josiah's voice carried over the initial volley of gunfire. "Hold your positions! Make every shot count!" The town's defenders responded with disciplined fire. Young Miguel Martinez and his brothers, positioned in the livery stable, picked off 3 riders trying to flank the eastern approach. Sarah Thompson, commanding the general store's upper floor, proved that a woman's eye was just as keen as any man's when it came to long-range shooting. "They're pushing hard on the south side," Tom Wilson called out, using the old creek bed. "For cover!" Josiah moved like a ghost through the town's prepared routes, appearing wherever the fighting was thickest. His rifle spoke with terrible precision, not always killing, but every shot removing another threat from the battle. "Getting low on ammunition," came a cry from the bank's defenders. "Sister Mary Catherine," Josiah called out. "Time for the Lord's provision." The nun triggered a clever system of ropes and pulleys, sending ammunition boxes sliding down from the bell tower to various fighting positions. Lee's men discovered too late that the town's defenders had prepared for a long siege. "Mighty clever, Kane," Lee's voice carried across the battlefield, "but I've got something special for your flock." A wagon appeared at the edge of town, loaded with oil barrels. Lee meant to burn them out, but before his men could light the first, a torch, Tom Wilson demonstrated why Civil War veterans were still dangerous. His dynamite throw was perfect, turning the wagon into a spectacular fireball. "The Lord works in mysterious ways," Wilson chuckled, ducking return fire. The battle shifted into close quarters fighting as some of Lee's men breached the outer defenses. They found themselves in a maze of prepared kill zones, where even the children contributed by triggering traps and false trails. Josiah encountered 3 gunmen in what remained of the church. His draw was invisible. One moment his hands were empty, the next 3 shots had found their marks. None dead, but none would shoot straight again. "Still fast," Lee's voice came from behind him. The outlaw leader stood in the church doorway, bandaged but deadly. "But are you fast enough to save everyone?" As if on cue, screams erupted from the bank. Some of Lee's men had found the tunnel they'd dug during the night. "Have to choose, Kane." Lee grinned through blood-stained bandages. "Face me or save your precious flock. Time to decide, ranger or preacher." Josiah's answer was a bullet that grazed Lee's good ear. "Who says I have to choose?" The battle for Lost Creek had become a storm of lead and courage, where ordinary people discovered extraordinary strength. Sarah Thompson protected a wounded defender while shooting one-handed. Miguel Martinez rode through gunfire to get medicine to the makeshift hospital. Sister Mary Catherine proved that faith and marksmanship could coexist, and through it all moved Josiah Kane, both ranger and preacher, dealing justice and mercy in equal measure. His gun spoke the language of law, while his voice called out psalms and encouragement. He was two men now, fully and completely, serving both God and justice. The sun climbed toward noon, painting the battlefield in harsh light and sharp shadows. Lee's men were learning a hard lesson. It's one thing to face armed opponents, another entirely to fight people defending their very souls. "Push them back," Josiah commanded, as another wave of attackers tried to reach the bank. "Show them what faith can do." The defenders of Lost Creek answered with a fury that would have made angels weep. They weren't just fighting for their lives anymore. They were fighting for something far more precious. Their souls were on the line, and they meant to keep them clean. The battle for Lost Creek reached its turning point in blood and thunder. Lee's men, finding themselves outmaneuvered at every turn, began to break. Some fled into the harsh Texas landscape, while others surrendered to the righteous fury of the townspeople they'd underestimated. But in the burning ruins of the church, two men faced each other for a reckoning 15 years in the making. "You could have had it all." Lee spat blood onto the scorched floorboards. "The documents, the power, the gold. Instead, you chose these simple folk over glory." Josiah stood in the shaft of light streaming through the damaged roof, his collar stained with gun smoke, his badge gleaming. "Chose redemption over damnation, James. Something you never understood." They circled each other in the sacred space, guns holstered, measuring each other like wolves before the final fight. Outside, the sounds of battle diminished as Lee's remaining. Men realized their leader was trapped. "Redemption?" Lee laughed, a harsh sound like breaking glass. "Is that what you found here, playing shepherd to these sheep? Does it wash the blood off your hands? Make you forget all the men you killed as a ranger?" "Every man I killed haunts me," Josiah replied calmly. "But your kind of killing, murder for profit, burning innocence, that's different. That's the devil's work." The devil's work. Lee's hand twitched near his gun. "I remember your work, Kane. Remember how you hunted the Carson gang. Left bodies from El Paso to the Red River. You weren't just a ranger. You were death with a badge." "Was," Josiah emphasized, "until you showed me where that path leads. Burning my family showed me what real evil looks like." Lee's smile was serpentine. "Your Sarah, she died brave, protecting secrets she didn't even fully understand. And little Mary—" He didn't finish as Josiah's gun seemed to materialize in his hand. "Don't speak their names with your forked tongue." Josiah's voice carried the weight of 15 years of grief. "You've poisoned enough holy things." The tension built like an approaching storm. Both men knew only one would walk out of the church. Alive, good and evil, law and chaos, redemption and damnation, all focused down to two men and their guns. "You know what's funny?" Lee's hand hovered over his holster. "I actually became a real deacon before turning bad, learned all about judgment and punishment. Let me show you what I learned." The draw was lightning fast, both men moving with the speed of legend. Lee's first shot struck Josiah's badge, spinning him halfway around. Josiah's return fire caught Lee's gun hand, but couldn't stop his second pistol from appearing. They exchanged shots in the sacred space, each bullet carrying years of hatred and revenge. Lee's aim was deadly, but Josiah moved like his old ranger namesake, a ghost untouchable by mortal lead. "Die, damn you!" Lee screamed, emptying his second gun. Wood splintered, glass shattered, but Josiah seemed protected by something beyond mere luck. "Not today, James." Josiah's voice was calm as a prayer. "Today, justice comes home." His final shot caught Lee square in the chest, right through his stolen deacon's collar. The outlaw staggered, disbelief written across his scarred face. "How?" Lee gasped, blood staining his black coat. "You're just a preacher now." "No." Josiah holstered his smoking gun. "I'm both. ranger and preacher, justice and mercy. God's justice comes in many forms. Lee collapsed against the altar, his lifeblood staining the sacred wood. "Finish it," he wheezed. "Send me to hell proper." Josiah knelt beside his fallen enemy. "That's God's decision now. But I'll give you what you never gave my family, a chance to make peace with your maker." "Peace?" Lee laughed blood. "There's no peace for men like us, Kane. We're killers, always will be." "Speak for yourself," Josiah replied, drawing his Bible from his coat. "I chose a different path." As Lee's life ebbed away, Josiah read the last rites. Not as a ranger delivering death, but as a preacher offering final mercy. Outside, the sounds of battle had completely ceased. Lost Creek had survived its trial by fire. Sister Mary Catherine found him there, still kneeling in prayer over his enemy's body. "It's over," she said softly. "The rest have surrendered or fled. The town is safe." Josiah stood slowly, feeling the weight of years lifting from his shoulders. "No, sister, it's not just over, it's finished." Finally and completely finished, he stepped out of the church into bright sunlight. The town had taken heavy damage, but like its people, it had emerged stronger. The defenders gathered around him, ordinary people who had found extraordinary courage. The ranger brought justice, Sister Mary Catherine observed, but the preacher brought redemption. "No," Josiah corrected, looking at his gathered flock. "They did. These good people showed me that revenge isn't justice. And justice without mercy isn't God's way." The sun climbed higher over Lost Creek, marking the beginning of a new day. The darkness that had haunted Josiah for 15 years had been burned away, not by vengeance, but by the light of faith and the courage of simple people standing against evil. A chapter had ended. The ranger had found his peace, the preacher had kept his faith, and somewhere Josiah believed Sarah and Mary were smiling. Sunday morning dawned bright over Lost Creek 1 week after the great battle. The church still stood in ruins, but its congregation gathered anyway, sitting on makeshift benches in the open air. Josiah Kane stood before them, both ranger's badge and preacher's collar catching the morning light. "We gather here," he began, his voice carrying across the crowd that had swelled with visitors from neighboring towns, "not in a house of God, but under his open sky. Sometimes that's where grace finds us best, not in buildings, but in the hearts of those who stand for what's right." Sister Mary Catherine sat in the front row, her habit still showing scorch marks from the fight. Beside her, Tom Wilson's shotgun rested within easy reach, a reminder that vigilance was still necessary, even in times of peace. "Many have asked what really happened here," Josiah continued, "why Lee and his men came, what they sought in our humble church. The truth is simple. They sought darkness and found light instead. They sought treasure and found something far more valuable, the courage of ordinary people defending their souls." Sarah Thompson, arm still bandaged from the battle, stood to lead the congregation in Amazing Grace, the hymn carried across the town where rebuilding had already begun. The bank's walls showed bullet holes, but its vault had protected the townspeople when they needed shelter most. Young Miguel Martinez, now wearing a deputy's badge, kept watch from the bell tower. The boy had earned it, showing courage that would have made any ranger proud. His family beamed with quiet pride from their pew. "This town has changed," Josiah observed, looking at faces that had become both harder and softer, harder against evil, softer toward each other. "We've all changed. Some would say a preacher bearing arms, leading good people to fight. That's against God's way. But I've learned that sometimes the good Lord needs both shepherds and sheepdogs to protect his flock." He touched his badge, then his collar. 15 years ago, I thought I had to choose between justice and mercy, between the law and the Lord. Lost Creek taught me different, taught me that true grace isn't found in choosing one or the other, but in finding the wisdom to be both. As the service ended, people lingered, sharing stories of the battle, making plans for rebuilding. The church would rise again, stronger than before. But more importantly, the spirit that had defended it would remain. Sister Mary Catherine found Josiah by Sarah and Mary's graves, which had survived the fighting untouched. "Your family would be proud," she said softly. "Not of the vengeance, but of the redemption." "Wasn't just my redemption," he replied, watching his congregation, his flock, his family begin their journey home. Every person in Lost Creek found something in themselves these past weeks, something stronger than fear, deeper than hate. And you, what did you find? Josiah smiled, touching both badge and collar. "Found out that sometimes God's grace works, through both law and scripture, through both justice and mercy." He looked at the rebuilding town, at the people who had become so much more than simple townspeople. "Found out that sometimes the Lord's work needs both rangers and preachers, and sometimes by His grace He lets us be both." The sun climbed higher over Lost Creek, promising another day of work, worship, and watchfulness. The town had earned its name, lost to evil, but found by grace. And in its heart, a man who had been both ranger and preacher had finally found his true calling, being exactly what his people needed when they needed it most. Amazing grace indeed.